Hello there, a very good evening and welcome to another edition of The Role of Law. Our topic of discussion today is regarding something quite important that affects everyone. There comes a time in everybody's life where if they choose to do so, they get married. And this holy union of marriage is of course protected not only by our religion, our culture, our way of life, but also by the laws that govern our country. And to discuss the legal consequences of a marriage and consequently separation, if that is the case, we have with us today attorney at law Jerusha, a prominent family lawyer here in Sri Lanka. A very good evening, madam, and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Charlotte.
Madam, so just to begin our discussion, sometimes many people get married for love. And I'm quite unaware of the legal consequences of a marriage and what it really means in the eyes of the law. What does it really mean?
So, putting it very simply, marriage generally goes as the union of man and woman to the exclusion of all others. But if you want to be recognized by the law as a union, then you have to register yourself. And in Sri Lanka, generally you can come under the marriage registration ordinance, that's the general ordinance, or the MMDA, the Muslim ordinance, or the Canadian one. And in the general one, you have to be above the age of 18, it has to be registered, you cannot be a bigamist, you should have had a legal separation if you are going in for another marriage, and there has to be consent.
Right.
Some of these are not followed in the other cultural ordinances.
And regarding the requirement for registration, there's an absolute requirement for registration, or?
So fortunately in Sri Lanka there is something called a de facto marriage, or you can be recognized as a cohabiting couple if the reasonable man sees and perceives you as a couple. So there is this case of Annama where a widower lived with the wife's sister, but for all intents and purposes they were man and wife and they were recognized. So yes, you have that option, but because you have no benefits in terms of what you can ask for in a time of separation, people like to get it registered. So they will come within the general purview or the cultural purview under an ordinance, so that at the time of a breakup they can enforce their rights.
So moving on to the most substantial part of this discussion, really, the reforms that are required in these areas of law. This general marriages ordinance, madam, it's been with us for quite a long time.
Yes.
Much like
early 1900s.
Since
the early 1900s.
Since the early 1900s, and much like other laws too in Sri Lanka, it is in dire need of reform. What are these areas?
Right. So if we take how we can put an end to a marriage that is registered under the general ordinance, we have only three methods. The first one is adultery, and in order to prove adultery, the standard is very high, it's beyond reasonable doubt. Now you know, if someone is in an adulterous relationship, they are not going to do it to get caught out. It's going to be behind closed doors generally. So having a court ask you to come and prove it beyond reasonable doubt is you need to catch somebody in the act, which is a high burden put on the victim or the innocent party themselves. So that is in need of some kind of, the standard of proof is in need of some kind of reform at the moment. Then we have the incurable impotence, which is a fairly straightforward non-consummation arm of the divorce laws, and then we have this final section and the most popularly used section, which is malicious desertion. So we don't per se have an arm that says if you are treated with cruelty. Cruelty is actually not a good enough reason to leave a marriage. It has to be malicious desertion. Malicious desertion is that somebody leaves you and doesn't return to the home. There is also a sub-context of that called constructive malicious desertion, which says somebody treated me so badly, I was forced to leave the home. That carries a little part of this whole idea of cruelty, but not enough, as shown in the case, if I can just go into that. One of my favorite judges, who's not with us anymore, Prasanna Jayawardena, in one of his really good judgments on family law, Gomas versus Gomas, there was an appeal from the district court in on this marriage issue, on this divorce issue, because this woman who had petitioned to leave on the grounds of constructive malicious desertion was refused a divorce because the court couldn't see that there was enough proof that there had been actual constructive malicious desertion. They said yes, there was some incident that took place, but you had come back and entertained him and had this relationship going on. So she was not allowed to leave a marriage that she didn't want to be a part of. And then it ended up on appeal in the Supreme Court. And Justice Jayawardena very regrettably had to hold with the district court judge, because the law is framed in such a way that the proof was not good enough to let her out of the marriage.
Right.
But he also suggested to Parliament that this has to go under reform very fast, because having these people trapped in these kind of situations is not what this union is about anyway, and the law will have to be reformed to incorporate something like cruelty, or even consent where it is mutual. On a mutual basis, mutual understanding, they can go for a divorce. So that was his suggestion.
Madam, diving a bit deep into some specific areas, you said that the area of adultery, there needs to be a change to the standard of proof. Now, one argument behind the whole reason why the standard of proof is so high, there are only two standards of proof, beyond reasonable doubt and on a balance of probabilities.
Correct.
So it's either the first, then it must, if it's not the first, then it must come into a balance of probabilities. But in a society like Sri Lanka especially, when a person is branded to be an adulterous person, there are the inevitable social consequences that follow, and that is part of the reason behind the whole requirement for a proof of the conduct beyond reasonable doubt. So how can you really, reconcile these two?
That is true. Even in the British law, which is a law that we kind of mirror or shadow, this act of adultery is seen as a very serious allegation, because it's not something, it's a sanctity of marriage is completely torn apart by a third party.
Even though adultery is not a criminal offense,
yes,
it
yes.
is only a civil offense.
You would be treated as a social pariah, so to speak.
Exactly.
So even in cases in the British law, Serio versus Serio, there is a very high standard you have to prove, which is understandable. So I don't think we can change that too much, because then each and every person will come along and say this one is an adulterer, that one is an adulterer. But I'm a massive proponent of bringing into use the no fault divorce base, to base a divorce on a no fault system, which is now being taken into consideration in South Africa, where they go with an extra ground saying this relationship does not exist anymore. It has naturally died out. We don't want to be placing blame, but we cannot be forced to live within the constraints of this relationship.
Right.
Also, England, though they have not pulled out the fault base too much, they have also gone to an easier method where there can be a slightly less bitter approach to finally getting away, which we don't have. We are based categorically on a fault-based
system. So someone has to bear the fault of the separation. Someone in the relationship is a wrongdoer, the other person is innocent. So based on the current system, of course, it's easier to twerk the system than to change it altogether. Speaking of ways that we can twerk the system, and now, of course, sexual impotency cannot be amended in any way. But you spoke about malicious desertion and constructive malicious desertion. Regarding the reforms in this area that could be brought about.
Yeah, so constructive malicious desertion is one of the fairly more used categories, and also even though we do not have a no fault system, I do on a daily basis a lot of divorces where people don't contest. Here it's called a non-contest system, where you try to say a basic story on one side and then the other person says no contest, and the matter comes to an end with minimum bitterness. But the issue with this is the person who is getting the divorce in their favor has to place some blame, and when the blame game starts,
it never ends.
It's I didn't and then the other person is like, how dare he go with. So it's a small thing.
So it starts off small and then it ends up being worse.
Yes, and then we are like in the middle of trying to, and I guess it's this is the most important relationship you'll ever have, and I guess people jump into it with a lot of hope. So at the end of it, there is all of this bitterness, and that is, it's called crushing the empty shell of the legality. That's a concept that was put forward in England to state that this marriage is now an empty shell. For whatever reason, this relationship has now irretrievably broken down, which is a common status that all of us have to prove before we come to the fault-based categories. So if it is so, what is the point in elongating this further and adding to the bitterness? It only makes more sense if we can scrap the bitterness go with maximum fairness and get it out of the way fast, because there are children and other people who will have to suffer these consequences for a very long time. It's not just because I get a divorce doesn't mean I start a fresh life. I might have to meet you on other things. So that is so we use constructive malicious desertion to kind of have this no contest or contest divorces, but I would say we will have to completely reform and come to this like a no fault based system, which will then bring the family can go on as a friendship and as a role and as a community without having this bitterness that forever you will have to hold against the other person.
So based on what you've said, malicious desertion or constructive malicious desertion is the closest kind of system or laws that we have towards the irreparable breakdown of marriage system that is there in England.
It is not exactly no fault either, because you have to show fault, but it's used in a certain way to just show minimum fault and get out of the situation, because when it's adultery you can't say no minimum adultery.
Right.
It is a very massive allegation. So we use the malicious desertion, somebody left home or somebody was made to leave home, as the closest version to leaving without too much drama.
Right.
But even that is still a fault based reasoning.
Speaking a bit about the practical aspect of this, how this really happens in society, could you give us a bit of an example of an incident of constructive malicious desertion and how irreparable breakdown of marriage kind of differs from it?
Yeah, so the sad part about, not digressing but just to support what you asked me, the sad part about not having reforms is that some of these people are even struggling during this corona COVID crisis, because when you're already coming from a very toxic relationship, the lockdown doesn't help. 24/7 you're looking at this person. So I've had a massive amount of spike in the cases I'm handling in this time with domestic violence, maintenance and also divorce. So even recently I handled a case like that. So just to give you an example, so what happens is, say you all are living together and say that this person is suspicious or is interfering with your work or is always getting into a fight with you. I say this person because I always say the man, and then all my male students will be like, what about the woman?
Including me, man.
Yes, I know, that's why I'm correcting myself. So this person will treat you in a way that, you know, you don't want to come home, you're being harassed, you're being suspected, your stuff is, he's rifling through your stuff, all of that. So you leave home and you make a police complaint and say, I'm leaving home for my own mental sanity, and then I will seek other fora to take this forward. That is constructive malicious desertion. Basically you're saying, because of the way I'm being treated, I cannot tolerate this anymore, so I have been forced. Constructively he is the one deserting me, but I have been forced to take the action, to act on it and leave the home. So that is what the practical version of that, and it's for many reasons. A lot of suspicious things have been taken, a lot of partners being suspicious is a reason, a lot of bad behavior like alcohol abuse and all of that, that's another reason, a lot of physical, so even domestic violence cases now because of corona, the protection order is given, but you're supposed to live in the same house, you're expected to live in the same house, because we can't throw people out during this time, because you know you will be infected. So you're living in 2 rooms adjoining, but there is a protection order. So these are some of the things that the general public is struggling with during this time that's already a pandemic. This much older pandemic is still on the rise.
And this has been a pertinent issue in the country for quite a long time, the lack of reforms in laws that affect the people. We instead focus on constitutional change and massive other changes, but we don't focus on the laws that affect everyday people. And for the benefit of the public, if there is someone, a member of the public who is suffering with a bad relationship, domestic violence, what are their possible courses of action that they can take, especially during this time where resources are limited and things that you can do, your fundamental right is limited. What can they really do right now? So
the basic thing that they can do at the moment is reach out to the police. And because of the older generations that pushed the Domestic Violence Act of 2005, the police themselves can apply to court and try and get you a restraining order. But you know, with now several police divisions being closed and lots of courts being closed, that gets
and even the resources in the police departments have been stretched.
Exactly, and I am not still to hear anyone saying in emergency assault situations you can reach out to this court. I have heard that magistrates will be working for certain things like prison cases and to elongate some orders and stuff like that, but nothing particularly posed or poised for domestic violence victims, which is sad because it's a life or death thing. If somebody is going to beat you up and you're not going, and you can't even go to a hospital today because that is another risk. So how do you go, I mean, how do you solve this? They are struggling, and these laws are long overdue, and justices of the Supreme Court in their wisdom have written in black and white. So now I think we'll have to look at the people's representatives to take this on. I'm pretty hopeful with our Justice Minister, who's a practicing lawyer, and he looks very poised. He was talking very highly and very effectively about the minimum age that the MMDA has, which he wants to change, because girl children can be married off under that act. So
there was also a private members bill that was put forth in Parliament.
Yes. So I think we might have to look at those things as a priority. Day-to-day people's struggles and changing the laws that actually affect the day-to-day people, because marriage is, almost everybody is going to face it, or at least know of an issue at some point of time. So I think that is something that will have to be looked at, and unfortunately, and you may not always agree with me, women seem to be victimized on a much larger scale. Gender-wise, it's women and children who suffer on a much larger scale. So this is something that has to be put an end to, and reform with the Maintenance Act, with the Domestic Violence Act. All of them are very old acts, and there has to be reforms. Lots of papers, lots of suggestions have been put forward, but we'll wait for the women and children's ministers and all of them to now take that up on a stronger basis.
So speaking of the initial, the large-scale overhaul kind of reforms that you proposed based from a fault-based system to the irreparable breakdown of marriage, which nobody has a fault. The couple just comes and says, we can't live with each other. So the argument against this, of course, is the fact that the unit of the family is protected even in the Constitution. While this family unit is protected in the Constitution, it is supposed to be protected in the law. Would this irreparable breakdown of marriage, or would the introduction of this into our law really tilt the scale on that? Where any time two people can come and say, it's not working out over the smallest of issue. That's one of the major concerns.
Yes, I think that has been always put forward, and the sad part is also that we are following the British system that's based on the biblical principle of God-hating divorce. So that is why there was this fault-based system, because they didn't want to release a lot of people easily out of this union, because that was it was a religious-based legal principle. Now we had really no attachment to that religious principle, but because of the colonization, we took over that as well. Now my issue with saying, okay, if we make it easy, will everyone get divorced, is I honestly, from working in this area, don't think I don't see anybody trying to make the marriage work because the system is difficult. Marriage is a thing, it is not made or broken in court, it is made or broken in your home. And if two people are unable to, there is no meeting of the minds, and they are unable to put in the work together, and they are unable to be happy, is it up to us to say, we are judging you, we think this is an important union, you stick there and figure it out? I feel like that is an unfair burden that we are placing on a couple. That they have the freedom to enter and exit, because a marriage, like I said, is a union made between those parties. The law is not really going to be helpful in that sense. From my personal experience, I've never really seen the difficult system assisting in keeping people in marriages. We still have a very high number of divorces, it's only growing. I had some old statistics about 14,000 odd all island being filed on a bi-monthly basis. It's probably much more now.
14,000 every 2 months.
Yeah, that was long ago. So there's probably very high numbers now, and I don't see the system being complicated stopping anybody, because it's the freedom of will that makes you stay in a marriage, and it's the same thing that takes you out. So I think it might be healthier if people have the comfort of knowing I can leave when I want to, and then they have the will to work at it, rather than be stuck in this really vicious cycle. And you won't even believe, I heard when I was in one of the outstation bars that the divorce case had gone on for 2 decades.
2 decades?
That's longer than a prison sentence in most cases. So that is a ridiculous amount of, so they said the parents' divorce is still going on, and the daughter also had applied in the same court in an urban bar just outside Colombo. So that to me is a ridiculous system, and its laws delay. It's probably a one-off case for that amount of years, but
even that is possible.
Even that is happening, and how is that healthy? Who is that helping?
But we haven't really factored in all the components or all the members of the family. It's not just the husband and the wife. There are, of course, children. How will this introduction or this change in law that you are proposing affect children and their status in society?
I'm glad you asked that question, because this is a very common occurrence with my clients. All of them say, I stayed in this marriage for the children. I stayed in this marriage for their well-being. But what I have noticed is that when the empty shell of a bad marriage is crushed and the parents' toxicity leaves the home, the kids thrive generally. I'm not here to say that it's easy on everyone. There is still a stigma. We come from a cultural kind of background. Divorce is still frowned upon. There is also the option of judicial separation that we have, which then fits in better with certain religious principles, and people are more comfortable with that. That doesn't give you the right to marry again, but for all intents and purposes you can live separately. It can be applied if you are living apart for 2 years, or if you are living apart for 7 years. A summary procedure, a very fast procedure will be used for judicial separation. I personally have seen that these people who genuinely believe that they are doing their children a favor and have lived in these marriages, very recently I did a case of a lady who has been in this marriage for over, I think, 30 years, extremely toxic. Anything you can think of has taken place in that marriage. And she wrote at the end of her note to us, and my children are now refusing to get married because of everything they have seen. So I think that speaks for itself in the kind of trauma and the kind of mental state that children end up with, which might be saved if, because you can divorce your partner, you can't divorce your children. That's forever going to be.
Neither of the parents can do
Neither of them can, and they have a duty by law, and in our law up to 25, to look after a child who needs that kind of support. So I have also another case where the parents went apart, but they also meet on family holidays. And both parents who have different partners, I'm not saying these are ideal. I'm not trying to be this liberal person who's advocating for this, but the truth is I will pick any day this kind of understanding rather than being locked in a toxic kind of relationship. So that's why I would think this whole thing of do it for the children to me makes absolutely no sense.
But then there are, of course, the legal consequences that flow. Children will not have their fathers if they have already been conceived and then the divorce is settled in between. Illegitimacy comes into play. Yeah. There are many other consequences. And do we really have even precedents from other jurisdictions that we shadow, like you said, on how we can deal with those laws as well?
So as of now, the good news is illegitimacy is not a thing. Because you might not be in a marital state, but you had the child, the child is fully legitimate.
Right.
So we follow the English principle, and here if the father's name is on the birth certificate, that still stands. They're going to remove that part about married, where the parents are married also, that has been proposed here. So we will follow. Britain already has that, where the child's legitimacy is covered, maintenance, even if you're an heir to a particular throne or whatever, that still goes down. Whatever status your parents' marriage is in. So that is covered. What was the other thing you asked me? You asked about illegitimacy and
of course the social stigma that surrounds this entire thing.
That is something that
cannot be addressed by the law.
That cannot be addressed by the law, and judging, this can happen to anybody. So those who stand on judgment, this may happen to you, it may happen to your children, and then you know better than to go around. And I don't understand judging somebody because their relationship didn't work and they went apart. I don't understand that. Is it healthier to live together and then cheat and do all kinds of things and teach your children that this is normal? Or respectfully leave a union that isn't working for you and show your children that you can live individually with your head held high and give the best of yourself to the children, because lots of people who are in these toxic relationships are going through very heavy depression. And though we talk about depression like, I'm depressed because their LPL might get delayed, it is a serious mental health concern. So for people living with that kind of thing, I mean, this union there has to be a way to decently get out of it. Then imagine you're a child and your mom is unable to connect with you on a regular basis because she's suffering from heavy depression. So I have seen all of these are real life facts that I see in my cases. And my understanding and what I've seen children thrive if the relationship, the empty shell is crushed, and children are allowed to move on. And I have seen children who have really struggled, but the stigma thing is true. And there are some people who want to wait till their kids marry, they are unable to get good proposals. In outer parts of Colombo, outer parts of Sri Lanka, it is still true. And I unfortunately don't have a legal remedy for that. That is a thing that people need to stop doing because they don't know the other person's life and they're holding them to a imprisonment which they might not be able to bear.
So we're in the final few minutes of our show. Let's discuss the real possibility of reform in this area. Of course, we inherently have the issue of lack of female representation in Parliament, and as you quite rightly pointed out, women are more often on the receiving end of domestic violence and other issues surrounding a marriage, especially in Sri Lanka. So is there a real possibility of these reforms coming about in at least the near future?
Yeah, I just want to add, and I don't want to be a spokesperson for the Muslim community because they have stunning, amazing representation themselves, but some of the things they are finding difficult with the MMDA is the fact that children can be any age, a girl can be any age and be a bride. Girls don't get to consent to their wedding. It is a male relative, a guardian who consents. There is this issue of dowry. There is this other issue of women not being allowed to be qazis. The qazi court structure has no monitoring. There is no quantum for maintenance. So it can be a ridiculously low amount. There is no mandatory payment of alimony. So leaving a marriage sometimes is not an option for these women because how do they look after their children? How do they feed them? And a number of other things that they are going through. And I have seen different groups at different levels pushing for these reforms. Like I said, I'm a little hopeful with the Justice Minister bringing about these things and a man speaking also. It helps because like Ruth RGB said, you need to go in a way where everyone will support you. Just because we are women, yes, female representation is utmost important and they should be leading it, but also everybody should be supporting them. So I am hopeful that the MMDA will see some reforms, and our general marriage ordinance is from 1907, and definitely there is real need for change. If you just look at the recent 2017 judgment of Prasanna Jayawardena that I mentioned, I think we can just start with having no fault divorces as a clause. And I am hopeful. I mean, right now the way things are going, I can't see these important issues being raised in Parliament, but I'm hopeful that in the near future somebody will bring this up and that will be supported because these are day-to-day issues faced by people, and women and children are being victimized because of these acts. And there is 225 of us sitting there who can definitely make this change.
And who should make this change?
Who definitely should, because they have wives, children. That is not a good enough reason, because this is 52% of the population. And I'm not only saying there are several marriages that men are victims too. I've seen it for myself. I've represented them. I take that, but the majority is always women and children. They are your largest voter base. And if they want to get into Parliament in the next 4 years again, I would say address these issues immediately. So.
Thank you very much, Madam, for shedding clarity on this not too often discussed topic, but a topic that has much importance in all of our lives because all of us definitely have our mothers, our sisters, our nieces, our cousins, and this in that way affects us all. Thank you very much, Madam, once again for coming on our show. And thank you very much to all our viewers out there for tuning in to The Role of Law. Until we meet again next week, take care and God bless.